Vincenzo Florio was a wealthy man. He made his money in wine and spices, married a princess and brought a crocodile home from his honeymoon. Inspired by other early car races elsewhere in Europe, he decided to create one of his own here in Sicily. This is the story of one of the greatest car races ever, the story of Targa Florio.
The original Targa Florio, the Grand Circuit, was a 100-kilometre loop around these mountains which took in 900 different bends that the hard-pressed navigators had to try and remember, before a 6-kilometre blast along the Buenfanello Strait down on the coast, a long straight which is actually longer than the Mulsanne Strait at Le Mans. There wasn't really room for conventional wheel-to-wheel racing, so they set them off from here at 2-minute intervals, time trial style.
We walked around the derelict grandstand and pit lane and decided to give it a go ourselves. The winner of the first race in 1906 was a chap called Alessandro Cagno, also known as Sandrin. He was Fiat Cars employee number 3. He also raced Fiat-powered motorboats and opened Italy's first aviation school. He even designed a primitive grenade launcher. He was fairly typical of the tally-ho types that participated in early motorsport in Europe.
And Sandrin won that first race in 1906 with a 14.8 litre 5-cylinder Italo race car, which unbelievably put out only 40 bhp. Now, even our little Fiat 500 hire car here has 69 bhp from its thrashy little 1.2. We've managed to rent this little Piccolo pocket rocket, and we're following in the tyre tracks of some of the motorsport's greatest drivers and greatest cars. Now, this might not be the fastest or the sexiest beast on the island of Sicily, but as we all know, nothing handles like a rental.
Also, of the 32 manufacturers that have won stuff here, more than half of them are Italian, and they've all since been swallowed up by the Fiat family. There's Alfa Romeo, Lancia, who else?
Maserati,
yeah,
Abarth,
and of course Ferrari.
The Targa Florio reads like the who's who of motorsport greats. Some of the greatest drivers and greatest cars have competed on this road circuit. People like Graham Hill, the Ascaris, there were, who else? Fangio, Moss.
Paddy Hopkirk.
Paddy Hopkirk even, that's right. Probably one of the most famous though is Vincenzo Lancia, who was hired by Fiat to race on this circuit even though he got his own car company. And he had a fabulous reputation, like any typical Italian I guess, for driving absolutely flat out and then breaking down just before the finish line. These roads up in rural Sicily must have been absolutely terrifying at speeds back in the day.
They're pretty scary now, and there's a smattering of tarmac on it, but of course back then most of it was scree, gravel and dirt tracks. Of the 1910 race, only 5 cars entered and only 2 of those finished. However, from there the Targa Florio really grew, both in terms of amount of entrants and distance covered, and it's important also to recognise that the course changed a number of times over the years, but it was always long distance and it was always gruelling.
In 1912 they changed the circuit, didn't they? So it wasn't a loop of the mountains, it was actually a complete loop of the island, which was about 1,000 kilometres in total. And it was won by the first non-Italian. It was actually a Yorkshireman called Cyril Snipe. And there doesn't seem to be anything about him in the history books, even though it was an amazing feat really in his day. The involvement of Alfa Romeo in the Targa Florio actually starts in 1920 when a certain Mr. Enzo Ferrari raced an Alfa, set the fastest lap time as well. Now, Enzo had 5 stabs at the Targa Florio, and his best ever finish was a second, although he did set the fastest lap in 1920 in that Alfa.
In 1924, Mercedes won for the very first time. The driver was a chap called Christian Werner, and he painted his Silver Arrow red in order to confuse the locals into not throwing rocks at his German car, blending with the locals. The 20s really did belong to Bugatti. They won 5 consecutive times with various drivers at the helm. And the Type 35 was an absolutely beautiful piece of engineering, an absolutely beautiful machine, and it was unbeatable.
The most interesting Bugatti driver was a certain Madame Junek, who's this Czech aristocrat. And she was fastidious about taking pace notes, and she would actually walk the entire course, making notes as she went along.
Tazio Nuvolari won in 1931 on the Grande circuit, and again in 32 on the Piccolo circuit. Ferdinand Porsche later described Nuvolari as the greatest driver of the past, the present and the future. Targa Florio was the place where the top drivers were starting to come to prove themselves.
So they were constantly changing the route of the Targa Florio, and between 1937 and 1940 it was at its shortest, and it was just a loop around Favorita Park. And then World War II, of course, brought Targa Florio to an end in 1940.
Enzo Ferrari never won here as a driver, yet his first sports car, the Ferrari 166, did win in 1948, with Russian Prince Igor Nikolaevich Trubetskoy driving. He teamed up with working-class Sardinian Clemente Biondetti to bring home the first win for Ferrari.
He's had 8 goes at those names. that was pretty good, that was.
I'm still not sure it's right.
He was married to the world's richest woman at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's
so she
right.
bankrolled his little hobby here at Targa Florio. The shorter Piccolo circuit returned in 1951, but that was still a grueling 70k or so, with 600 bends that navigators had to try and negotiate. And they held practice days just on the public roads. They just slapped the race plates on and off they went.
The locals loved Targa Florio. They loved what it did for Sicily. It was never the wealthiest part of Italy, yet the Targa Florio race brought it some serious international prestige. If drivers broke down, they were often invited in for dinner whilst they were waiting for recovery. And so into the mountains and Colassano, a town rich in history of the race. In 1953, the race became part of the FIA-sanctioned World Sports Car Race Series. It also marked the start of a period of domination by the German manufacturers.
In 1955, Stirling, Moss and Fangio took a 1-2 victory in the fabulous Mercedes 300 SLR. Moss reckons it was the finest car that he'd ever driven. But Mercedes had started to lose their interest in sports car racing by this time after the horrific crash at Le Mans, which had actually left 82 people dead. So they took the 1-2 victory, they took the sports car championship, but it was the last time that they actually raced at Targa Florio.
1956 saw the arrival of Porsche. Their aristocratic PR man, Fritz Huschke van Hanstein, known as the Racing Baron, drove a Porsche 550 all the way from Stuttgart down to Sicily, hired old hand Umberto Maglioli and went on to win. Vincenzo Florio died in 1959. His final words were, "The race must not die with me." His legacy lives on. A local airport is named after him, there's a ship named after him, and even this street.
It's mad to think that they were racing through here though at speed.
100 miles an hour down the high street.
Perhaps the most famous Targa Florio race was 1968, when the British driver Vic Elford managed to win despite losing 18 minutes on the first lap thanks to a puncture in his Porsche 907.
Brian Redman won for Porsche in 1970. He describes the time that his 908 car was unveiled. Porsche took the dust sheets off, they took the bodywork off, and he sat in the chassis and he spotted that his legs were protruding ahead of the front axle.
And they also said to him that if he is going to have a crash, it would be better if he had a crash on the right-hand side because the fuel tank was on the left-hand side. On the first lap, he had a crash, left-hand side, and it was an absolute fireball. Luckily, he managed to walk away from it.
Porsche won 11 times at the Targa Florio, more than any other manufacturer. No wonder they use the name Targa on their convertibles.
Targa actually means shield.
Nino Vaccarello is a local hero. He was actually the head of the local accountancy school, and in '65 he won here in a Ferrari. He also won in '71 and again in '75 in an Alfa Romeo. Vaccarello would have won in '66 too, but he slowed the car to wave at fans, lost control and hit a wall. The walls here still bear VV or VN for Viva Vaccarello or Viva Nino. He really is a local hero. In 1970, Vaccarello entered in the most powerful car ever to compete in the Targa Florio. It was a 600 bhp V12 Ferrari 512S. That year though, he came in fourth. Porsche tended to win here in more modestly powered nimble cars, whereas Italians, they went for power.
Respected Austrian driver Helmut Marko took his Alfa 33 to Targa Florio in 1972 and he set a blistering fastest lap, averaging the Piccolo course at about 80 miles per hour. However, afterwards he said that the Targa Florio had become totally insane. You see, in the 1970s, practice days were still held on public roads and there were children, livestock, local traffic going around their daily business.
By now the cars were reaching speeds higher than ever before, and the drivers were starting to paint coded signs on curbstones and corners in order to help them spot the apex and get every single turn right. In 1973, privateer Charles Blythe crashed his Lancia Fulvia, and there was another fatality elsewhere. Yet, despite this, it's remarkable that there were so few fatalities and injuries at the Targa Florio.
There was only 9, in fact, I think, in the 71 years that they ran the Targa Florio. Even in the modern era, there were still dangers, such as horseshoe nails, which littered the circuit. There was virtually no guardrails, and there was very, very little runoff. It was incredibly dangerous. This was no circuit to get a puncture at speed.
I think one of the reasons there were so few injuries and so few accidents at the Targa Florio is because it was a relatively low speed lap. It was so tight and so twisty, and the only place it could really get any speed at was this long Buonfanello straight.
Nevertheless, it was on the straight that we're on that the Targa Florio's very last race came to a rather grisly end.
The crash in 1977 sealed the Targa Florio's fate. The police stopped the race on the 4th lap after hill climb specialist Gabriele Ciuti lost part of the aerodynamic bodywork on his car and crashed at 100 miles an hour here at the end of the long Buonfanello straight. At 100 miles an hour he went into the crowd, killed 2, injured 2 more and ended up in a coma himself. In the end, common sense, politics and safety demands conspired to end the most glorious race of all, the Targa Florio. Targa Florio brought international recognition to Sicily. In its heyday, it had 750,000 people turn up to cheer the drivers on. And the race had all the ingredients of Sicily itself: passion, politics, triumph and tragedy. Just don't ask us what our lap time was.